Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 22nd of June. Hopefully the mic is better. And today we're going to be focusing on Krasnohorivka and the Vovchansk riverfront. But most of the video will be discussing developments around the Toretsk axis and the battles around Vovchansk. And the goal is going to be to just sort of fill up any gaps and any sort of reporting that I may have missed over the past week. And then we'll move on from there in future videos where hopefully I'll be able to do more in-depth topographical and analyses based on units. That's really what I'm going to try to focus on in the coming videos. But for today, we're just going to look at some important updates. Starting off in Krasnohorivka, this is a video from June 21st. It came from the 9th Infantry Battalion of the 59th Motorized Brigade. Now, important to note, this unit is also operating further north, defending in the Novelske Karlivka general area just west of Natalove, and so you can see how its forces are now split. So at least one of its battalions is helping with at least trying to stabilize the line in Krasnohorivka, but clearly it has not been enough because this new video shows how the Russians were able to advance 200 meters north of the refractory plant, which was the previous demarcation line, and was able to hold firm for, you could say, a month and a half along Kirova Street. And now you've had the Russians find a gap in their infantry have exploited that, advancing from the apartments where they do have the elevation advantage, of course, because we're looking at 5, 6, 7, 8-story buildings overlooking a lot of private residential areas where the Ukrainians are defending. So the Russian forces are able to then move their way northwards into these residential streets, and that's what happened in this video. And then they fired on the 2 Russian soldiers, the Ukrainians, that were operating in these houses. And so it shows you that the urban battles have shifted further northwards, and this is under the actual command of a unit that was recently rotated to give more reinforcements. Now, moving further north, the Russians continue exploiting the capture of Natalove to expand westwards. What we're seeing now is they were able to enter into the first dachas in the northern section of Karlivka, just north of the reservoir area. This is one of the last populated regions that the Ukrainians control in the sector just east of the Vovchansk River. And so now Russian forces, based on this particular video from June 19th, this is from the 25th Airborne Brigade, their FPVs, they struck 3 Russian vehicles that were advancing along this paved road directly through this part of the settlement. And they were trying to, of course, advance towards that river crossing and perhaps to try to catch any sort of remaining Ukrainian troops past the Vovchansk River off guard. And so now you see how the fighting has shifted. If we look at the extent of the advances, it amounts to somewhere in the ballpark of, I guess you could say, a kilometer, 1.5 kilometers westwards. And you could see how the Ukrainians, their natural fallback position, I've been stressing this for a very long time, is just west of Karlivka. Karlivka itself is east of the Vovchansk River. And then to the west, you have another part of the settlement, and then surrounded by that, you have various hills, most notably this one over here that I'm marking with the red rectangle, and then various strongholds that were built up, and the Ukrainians are now trying to buy time in order to connect all of them together in the hopes that it could become a solid stabilization line once they lose an area like Krasnohorivka, where we don't have updates from, but you do have defense from the 53rd, 25th Brigades. And then 56th Brigade is interesting because its forces are split. Some are actually operating on the Kharkiv border. Others are operating around Bakhmut, and we're going to talk about that later on. So I don't know how many are really operating here nowadays, and that's a part of why the Russians were able to exploit some of these advances. Now, moving on, we're going to look elsewhere away from the regions west of Avdiivka and look north of Avdiivka at the New York Toretsk area. This is a very important sector now. The Russian forces, as I'm going to explain later on, they were able to notice a gap in the Ukrainian line, not in terms of trenches necessarily, but more so in terms of manpower. And first of all, around Alexandropil, this is one axis where the Russian forces, they tried to establish a sort of attack vector that could eventually reach the settlement, and they wanted to do this by getting control of hills that are on parity elevation-wise with the hill on which Alexandropil is located. And so that's the explanation for why they advanced in this particular direction where I'm pointing the arrows. And the Ukrainians, they were able to stabilize the line over here and slightly push back the Russians. I guess you could say it's like a 400-meter retreat past this trench over here. And so there are some defenses that the Russian forces have to overcome on the way to Alexandropol. But this does not mean that the fighting has ended. So the Ukrainians actually do have a unit that's, I guess its responsibility would be to defend generally west of New York. And that would be the 2nd Galician National Guard Brigade. I have no idea as to its combat experience. It seems like it's a relatively new unit when it comes to frontline fighting, but I have to check that. Then you look at the 109th Donetsk Territorial Defense Brigade. That unit also has some of its forces split, defending around the regions north of Arkhangelsk, but also perhaps around the suburbs of New York. And so you do have, at the very least, like these two brigades that are operating together here, not of the highest caliber by any means, but at the very least they do have this horizontal part of the front line filled. And it's a region that's, I guess you could say, if we measure it, spans around 15 kilometers. And then you have another 15 kilometers that spans northwards. It goes basically in a vertical direction, just running parallel to the city of Karlivka. And it goes all the way from Shiroka Balka to Pivdenie, Shumi, Zhuzba, these various suburbs of the city of Toretsk. And yeah, it's a front line that spans 20 kilometers. And then you look at the Ukrainian troop concentration here, and it is extremely low. Part of that is because on June 20th, there was an announcement that the 24th Mechanized Brigade was being moved to help with the defense of Chasiv Yar. And this was important because the Russian forces, as we're going to get into, they were able to make important gains in Chasiv Yar, just on the general front line on June 19th. And so, yeah, there's a clear cause and effect over there. And so the 24th, it's probably been meaning to move there for a while, but that sort of sped up the process. And then you're left wondering what's left defending around Toretsk, because the 24th Brigade, generally its responsibility was in the area between Ozari and Yivka, and then going all the way south to like Shiroka Balka, as I said before. And it is relatively experienced units that fought in Bakhmut, for instance, and so it was combat capable, especially in defensive operations in this built-up area. But then you're asking which unit replaced it, and there isn't really a good answer, because if you're looking at the troops here, then you have 78th Hertz Regiment. This is an air assault unit. So again, it's a bit different from the operations that it conducted during the summer counteroffensive, because the Hertz Regiment was formed. It's a part of the 9th Air Assault Corps for the Ukrainian side, or actually 7th Air Assault Corps, I believe. And so they were involved more so in offensive activity. And so there's a question about their defensive capacity. And again, they didn't really have experience outside of the Orkiv sector, because that's when it was formed. And so now they've been moved here, detached from any other air assault unit, really detached from any other major unit, any sort of brigade. And so the regiment is really here on its own. I would assume it's a couple hundred men, and they are meant to hold these trenches over here, a lot of them located on hills. And then I guess the issue is when you look at some of the gaps here, because even though this area is very well built, you can look at these yellow fortifications that include dragon's teeth, ditches, whatever it may be, dugouts as well. There is a very slight gap in the region just between the Donbas Canal and the suburb Shumi. It's like a 5-kilometer region, and this area is less well built. It's sort of this hinterlands between Karlivka to the southeast and then to the northwest Toretsk, and it's the specific region where the Russians are advancing through, of course, because Shumi itself is on a hill, and it's less defended by the Ukrainians, and even less so now that the 24th Brigade left. In terms of a question mark, there may be an additional rifle battalion that is acting independently that's operating around here, but there isn't proof that this unit has been operating here for basically a year now, and so it is an open question whether they're still here. They would also bring in a couple hundred additional troops to the front line to defend if that were the case. But now let's get into the actual Russian advances in this sector, which again, the Russian forces here are also relatively small in size. It's not like the Russians diverted a massive amount into here yet. Maybe that could change depending on how the battle unfolds. But it does seem like a way of, first of all, exposing Ukrainian weak points, and then trying to, of course, shape the battlefield in a way that would be conducive for future advances, and then also to try to continue redirecting Ukrainian troops from one place to another, because it's not the first time this has happened on the front line in an area that was previously quiet and had troops redirected away from it. So the previous front line change from my last video looked something like this, I believe, and since then you've had confirmation from essentially all sides, but Ukrainian sources have also been quick to comment on this, whether it be Deep State or Petrenko, so it's not just a Russian rumor. They were confirming the capture of Sumy as well. If we're looking at the full polygon for the Russian advances beginning, I think, June 19th, something of the sort, then you could see it's 7.5 square kilometers that was captured in the process roughly. And now recently, based on the June 21st updates, the Russians were able to advance 2.4 kilometers westwards and get control over this relatively small village, Sumy. It's an area that has a bunch of gardens and a few houses. I guess the most interesting part would be that this region in between Toretsk and Karlivka has 5 major mining facilities, and then each one has its own slag heap. And those slag heaps, of course, they vary in size, but they are amazing vantage points for whatever side controls them. And so, for instance, here you see that Pivdenia, which is still being contested, but definitely would be a good position for the Russians to advance through or flank from the north. Pivdenia has this massive landfill over here, and there's a few smaller ones if you look further westwards. And then Sumy as well has one of the Russians captured and one that they're approaching right now. And the Ukrainians, they of course prepared for this. They built some trenches in the region, and now the Russians are trying to overrun those same areas. Now, if we are on the topic of elevation, and the Russian forces are very close to getting full control over a massive ridge that really runs through all of Karlivka and runs adjacent to the rail line that you see marked over here, and then reaches Mayorsk and then branches out either northwards or westwards through Toretsk. And so that entire railway embankment, it's on a massive ridge that the Russians almost completely control. And the final piece of the puzzle, you could say, is Sumy and the surrounding regions. And the region where the Russians first advanced through isn't necessarily on higher elevation, but you could see how it's an area that is less well defended. And then from there, the Russians flanked Sumy from the north and, of course, had direct attacks in conjunction. And from there, they were able to secure the hill on which Sumy is located. Looking further southwest, Zalizhny is also on higher elevation. It's also a hilly area, very rugged terrain, a lot of landfills as well, as I said. And so that's an area that the Russians are perhaps trying to flank, perhaps would be interested in getting control over those hills. And then also Pivdenia does have relatively high elevation. But at that point, once you look further westwards at an area like New York or the Kryvyi Toretsk River Valley, which is the basically the area that's nearby to the river that runs north-south over here. And so that entire river valley region, which extends into Toretsk, which is also located on a relatively low elevation, it really is, a lot of these areas really are floodplains. And the Russian forces, they are in the process of getting control of a lot of suburbs that just directly overlook a lot of the lower elevated regions, for instance, around Toretsk, especially in the westernmost portion of the city. At the very least, when you look at the eastern approaches, some of those areas are in higher elevation, both because the ridge extends to there through certain parts of Pivnishne, but also because the eastern portions have this massive area with apartment buildings, hospitals, whatever it may be. And then you look further westward, and it becomes these private residential areas. The center also has a lot of structures, for instance, so that's a good area to defend. And then the one exception would be these huge landfills. The surrounding regions, of course, the battlefield would be on low elevation, but these three massive landfills, you could say, those would give the Ukrainians an advantage in basically using it to overlook any sort of combat that's occurring several kilometers to the east. And so hopefully that gives you guys a better idea of the topography in the region. Next, I would look out for what Russia does in terms of its troop composition over here, and whether they continue pushing from Sumy both westwards, but also importantly trying to close this salient further southwards in Pivdenia to try to secure the remaining fortified areas on the ceasefire line from 2014. Now moving on to the Chasiv Yar front, fighting has really intensified here in the past week, you could say. Starting off with the Canal micro-district, the Russian forces are making gradual advances through that particular region, we have confirmation of additional Russian gains in the northeastern section in the garage compartments. And this is an area that the Russian forces were sort of bogged down in last month when they tried to advance through that direction. And eventually they just opted to advance south directly and get control over various apartment buildings, using the garages as sort of launching point from there. And you had various attempts by the Ukrainians, whether it be from foreign units or National Guards, like these foreign volunteer units that you have operating here, that recorded videos of themselves trying to counterattack into the garage region or into the dachas located further north over here. And now we're seeing just a gradual Russian advance that I guess you could say amounts to something like 200, 300 meters. And then looking further northwards, an area that is really interesting to me is Karlivka, because now we're seeing the second time in, I guess, a month or 2 months where the line here is just completely broken, and the Russians were able to utilize the horizontal road that goes through the village to directly reach the canal. This is something that really shouldn't be happening if the Ukrainians are serious about maintaining control of Karlivka for an extended period of time, which should be their goal, because Karlivka is on a hill and it acts as a buffer for the canal line, which gives the Ukrainians more time to build it up in lieu of the Russians trying to approach those regions and cross over them. And so let's just go through some of the geolocations from this region. We have video from June 17th of drones dropping grenades onto Russian infantry in the eastern sections of the village. This was just Russian efforts to dismount forces in the approaches to the village. Were they able to advance a couple hundred meters? Looking a bit further eastwards, you did have a Russian attempt to advance using several BMPs and MTLBs, and then the Ukrainian drone companies, they of course coordinated. You have a lot of drone units operating here, like the Black Swan unit. That's the first one that comes to mind. And so here they just dropped grenades and destroyed 2 of those MTLBs advancing along the main road. So of course that's true, but at the same time, the vehicles were able to break through the line of contact and advance deep into the village itself. And then the vehicles that survived that drone assault, they were able to reach all the way to the canal. And there's a video here that was released from the 21st Battalion of the 56th Motorized Brigade that we talked about, where they ended up destroying the BMP near the canal crossing. And you can see that there's just a physical crossing along this road where you reach the other side of the canal, and then the infantry squad that was operating around the BMP, they were also killed. And so the attack itself was thwarted from crossing over, but it does mean that there is this large puncture in the Ukrainian line in Karlivka. Not the first time it happened, it also happened in the previous attempts by Russian motorized units to cross over, and in the last time they were actually successful in doing so when an MTLB crossed over the canal and dismounted troops within the houses west of it and were able to occupy various trenches. And so now there's a question about whether the Ukrainians, using their new reinforcements, whether it be from the 56th Brigade or from the 24th Mechanized Brigade, which filmed the video that I talked about before in the Canal District, whether they can work together to solidify the line and prevent Karlivka from essentially becoming a gray zone and falling into Russian hands, or whether the Russians could essentially broaden their control here and start using this road as a more permanent route. And then that would be an issue, because then the Russians would have a very easy way to cross over the canal and undermine the Ukrainian defense line. Now, moving on to the city of Vovchansk, it's very important that we provide updates here because I wasn't able to for a very long time. So starting off with the westernmost approaches, I would say this is the least important part of this sector, the region around Bukhrovatka and Tsaritsia. The reason why is because you can see there are no real roads that cross from Russia into Ukraine and are able to supply, using trucks or using any sort of other vehicle, any sort of Russian contingent in these villages or in these forested areas. They're simply too isolated from the main Russian attack vector in the city of Vovchansk, and it's really becoming apparent now with the Russian focus specifically on the city and the nearby villages that they are really lowering this, relegating it in the pecking order. And so that means there's less forces operating here, much less vehicles coming in to try to provide reinforcements. And so the Ukrainians, they took advantage of it. It's not like they have many forces here either. but they did have a defensive contingent, including, you could say, elements of the GUR, but also the 101st Brigade for the protection of the General Staff, which fought around Kiev, now fighting around here. Their 2nd Battalion has been fighting around Toretsk, and they were able to, I guess, cross back into the village itself. We got a geolocation of that on June 20th of the Ukrainians filming the battles that are raging within the village. And so in terms of an advance for the Ukrainians, it's from the forest into the residential areas. So let's see, it's about 800 meters northwards. And then we have very little information about the remaining parts of the village, although it's likely that there is a very scarce Russian presence in Staritsia and Bukhurvatka, although the Russian forces definitely are building up their defensive works, for instance, for the long run in an area like Karlivka, but also around Hatisha and Ohirtseve to a larger extent. And then looking at the regions east of Vovchansk, this is also important to note. There was a rather large overestimation that I did at the beginning of the Russian offensive here as to how many fields and how many tree lines they really did control in the area northeast of Vovchansk. So either the Russian forces were pushed back gradually over the course of several weeks, or I just was inaccurate in my mapping of the situation. But I did have generally these areas is also under Russian control, which is important because these areas include a massive forest. It also includes a large part of a ridge that overlooks a chain of Ukrainian villages that essentially are running horizontally and then connect into Vovchansk, and is a very important Ukrainian defense line in the region. And so the fact that the region that I previously marked as Russian controlled is either a gray zone or under Ukrainian control, it does change the dynamics over here, and it shows that the Russian forces are not as spread out as we thought they were. But generally, we have received over the past week some videos confirming slight Russian advances several hundred meters westwards along this paved route over here, with the Russians trying to slightly broaden the front line to put pressure onto the village of Tikhe, which the Ukrainians were able to successfully take over this past week. And this village, Tikhe, it's north of the Vovcha River, and so it's important in that regard because it provides a buffer for the various other villages that are south of the river that are important for protecting the eastern flank of Vovchansk, because you have this paved road that runs directly into the southern portion of the city from there. And so Tikhe is now acting as a sort of vanguard for the Ukrainian forces, and so the fighting is going on and raging in the forested regions just to the north of it. Now we're getting into the regions of Vovchansk, where the recent Ukrainian reinforcements really have played an important role in turning the tide. So let's look at the 36th Marine Brigade and some of their activity in the past week. Here's this first geolocation from June 19th. 2 Russian soldiers surrendered during the battles to the brigade itself, located in the region just north of the Vovcha River, and this was essentially confirmation that the Ukrainians had crossed over in this particular region again, and this is in the eastern approaches of the city, in regions that are less densely populated. And then from June 20th, we have video here. It's a compilation which shows the 36th Brigade assaulting a trench that I believe was previously Ukrainian. This is like a local height in the region. It's not too significant, but it does overlook some of the nearby roads in the region and perhaps the floodplain around the river itself. And so yeah, there was just a trench set up over there and various dugouts and underground facilities. And so the Russians had occupied it, of course. They tried to repel the Ukrainian assaults. And so you had Ukrainian drones dropping grenades onto those Russian infantrymen. And then you had, of course, just firefights between the two, and the Ukrainians being able to solidify control over the defensive position, which gave us an idea of a Ukrainian advance amounting to about 400 meters northwards. So now you have this Ukrainian force from these Marines that is present in the easternmost section of the city as they try to get additional control over the private residences over there. Looking further westwards, there isn't much to say about the region that I guess is from the eastern approach all the way to the main road, Saborna streets. You just have generally this 1 kilometer span, 1.2 kilometer horizontal line that is mainly based around Karlivka streets, and that's the solid line of defense that the Ukrainians have set up, mainly from the 82nd Air Assault Brigade following their successful counterattacks, or I guess you could say late May, early June. and then some expansion northwards along some houses and this cemetery area. You also do have some Russian forward positions located in some of these northern approaches, and then the Ukrainians essentially setting up their line of contact around Ospienka Street and Khocholia Street over here, and then the connecting road. This northeastern entrance into Vovchansk is very important for the Russians to maintain because there is a paved road that runs east of Pledenivka and then makes its way all the way into this junction over here. And then from there, the Russians have the discretion to either go westwards and attack towards some of the positions in the apartments or eastwards towards the less dense areas. But again, it is important for the freedom of movement to maintain control over that region, and the Ukrainians are currently a couple hundred meters away from it, and so the region nearby is currently a gray zone where you have just these incessant firefights. Even worse in terms of the material damage and the human cost would be the region westwards. I guess I refer to it as downtown northern Vovchansk, because it's this region around Toretsk Street that runs southwards towards the river, and you have here the hubs of residents, for instance, but you also have a bunch of hospitals, schools, government facilities, post office, supermarkets, whatever it may be, a bunch of really important parts of urban life. And so the Ukrainians, the most important feature here that they maintain east of Toretsk Street is this 22 building citadel. And these are just really important high-rise apartments. They overlook the entirety of downtown, and that includes where the Russians are currently stationed in this nearby school over here, and then, for instance, to the northwest, where you have a lot of the Russian organizing points, or in the factories, for instance. You do have private residential areas where the Russians are in, which are, of course, being overlooked by the Ukrainian positions in the Citadel region. And then you also have Russian positions in the hospital region, for instance, or in the warehouses in the marketplace, which is also located nearby to Toretsk Street. And so that should give you an idea of where the Russians are utilizing. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians, they really are trying to concentrate a strong node within this apartment block region. And it's an area that really is impregnable in terms of like trying to assault it head on. It's very difficult. And so the Russian forces instead are trying to bomb it, whether it be through using self-propelled mortars or using TOS-1A artillery fire or the Fab 500, 1500s, whatever it may be. Here is a June 22nd compilation of the TOS-1A shelling of these apartment buildings. And this is really going on a daily basis. I guess more so artillery at this point than Fab strikes, but those are also going on, of course. We also have the ODAB 1500 thermobaric bombs being utilized by the Russian side on these apartment buildings. Relatively new bomb that's been incorporated with UMPK kits. Looking further north, you actually have the Ukrainians trying to take advantage of their forward positions to expand north and westwards along Toretsk streets to just further undermine the Russian connectivity with their positions that are even further south downtown. And we have confirmation of this based on a video from June 20th of FPV strikes on a house in Vovchansk that was retaken by the Ukrainians. I think the video is from the 204th Akhmat Regiment, which is just one of the Akhmat elements that's fighting in this urban battle. And so this is from June 20th. And then there's another video, which I guess is more ambiguous as to its release date. It's supposed to be from June 16th, but it shows the Akhmats dropping grenades onto houses in Vovchansk. But from the pro-Ukrainian side, I've seen some say that it's from early May, which would be initially when the Russians were entering into these regions for the first time. And if that's true, then I don't want to make a change to the map that is outdated, of course. And so I'm waiting for additional confirmation about a potential Ukrainian push westwards. It could be true, but we have to wait and see. And I guess the consequence is that you do have this passageway that is basically 1 kilometer wide. And this is the corridor that allows the Russian forces to then advance further south into an area like downtown Vovchansk and towards the Vovcha River. And so for the Ukrainian side, they have, of course, the capability to fire towards those Russian forces that are crossing over. But then advancing westwards would give them also a physical way to try to at least put more pressure on those troop movements for the Russians. But that's not verified at all right now. What is also not verified is the exact situation regarding the connection between the main Russian garrison in downtown Vovchansk and the aggregate plans, which I'm calling it a pocket with a question mark, because I don't know for sure whether the park, this Gorsky Park, is under Russian control or it's a gray zone or under Ukrainian control. The truth is that's probably fluid, and we're going to have to wait and see how it develops. But at least according to deep states, and I'm giving the pro-Ukrainian perspective, so keep that in mind. They're claiming that during the initial Russian breakthroughs further south, which allowed them to get into the hospital, you had Russian DRGs that made their way eastwards and were able to infiltrate into the aggregate plant. And after 10 days, they had control over this corridor that connected the hospital region and other streets like Toretsk Street or Shevchenko Street to the aggregate plant, and they were operating in that general region until around June 1st, when a lot of Ukrainian reinforcements were moved into the region. And that's when the Ukrainians were able to establish control over the Gorky Park, located just to the west of the aggregate plants. And that's when you had, and this is what's under dispute, but at least in my assessment, it would make much more sense if it was a couple dozen DRGs that were located in these buildings, as opposed to hundreds. It's just not realistic. And so the small companies, or I guess small squads that were located within the aggregate plant, they received aid from drones that dropped food or water into those regions. And so there were several attempts by the Russians to enter back into the facility and try to bolster the manpower there to get a full connection with the troops over there. And so there's just one incident that Deep State mentioned where there were 5 troops that tried entering in on June 6th, and then only one of them made it in, and the 4 others were presumably killed. And then on June 8th, 15 Russian soldiers were able to break through into the factory. And then either on the 13th or 14th of June, you had a Russian MTLB that broke through the Gorky Park area and was able to dismount soldiers within the aggregate plant. And so it shows you guys that because the Gorky Park is so small, and then eventually, the flood breaks loose, and you have troops that are able to pass through and overwhelm the Ukrainian attempts at creating a pocket. And so for the current time being, there's a question as to what's going on with this passageway. In my estimation, it's probably going back and forth, in that there is still a presence of Russian soldiers within the aggregate plants, a lot of them DRGs, and perhaps their attempts at escaping would be ones that are a dangerous endeavor, and that for their own safety, they're just deciding to stay within the facilities for the time being to avoid, getting into the actual battles outside. But at the same time, they're being fired upon by the Ukrainians. Here's a video from the 116th Mechanized Brigade reinforcement units, and they're firing ATGMs towards Russian positions in the apartments and the buildings in the area. And then here you have a video from June 15th of Ukrainian airstrike on this region. And that's important to note. There are Ukrainian airstrikes. The Air Force is active here. The Ukrainians are using GBU-39 small diameter bombs, and those ones, they are reported to have a 90% success rate in hitting their targets, and that is starkly opposed to the ground-launched small diameter bombs, which are a variation of the GBU-39s, and those ones are much more likely to not hit their target. A lot of that is due to Russian jamming efforts, and so now the Ukrainians are just favoring using whatever planes they have that are now fitted to launch these American or French munitions, and then dropping them from close quarters, which is something that also is pretty rare throughout the war, to see Ukrainian Air Force actively engaged in sorties above the line of contact. But here they're doing it in particular to try to cause havoc to the Russian groupings in these various large facilities, and that's what the Air Force is for in this case. And so, they're using sometimes various bombs that are then given the JDAM extended range kits, or given like the Hammer missiles, for instance, from the French side. And so that's the Ukrainian perspective on things. And the Ukrainians also released a compilation on, the Ukrainians, they released a compilation which showed some of their strikes onto Russian positions, which gave us confirmation that the Russians are operating very, very close to the aggregate plant about a week and 2 weeks ago, which is more recent than some of the other footage from this region. And so this is a video of a GBU-39 strike on a Russian position in a building on June 12th, very close to the factory. Here's another video, which is from June 14th, of the 9th Rifle Battalion. This is another unit that came in as a reinforcement. They conducted drone strikes onto Russian positions near government offices. And then here we have footage which shows a compilation from Akhmat from June 7th, which is from even before this point, which showed various Russian shelling efforts towards downtown Vovchansk, the residential areas, the river crossings, the apartments. And since then, the front line has changed. Since June 7th, the Russian forces have been able to gain ground in this downtown area, especially in the regions between Toretsk Street and Kharnia Street. And so this area, this 1 square kilometer region, it's been going back and forth, but at this point it appears that the Russians are in control of most of it. Now, before we end the video, I want to just briefly mention something in regards to the Russian military innovation, which is affecting the battlefield here. And so in March of 2024, there was a visit, I think, by Shoigu to the Sverdlov industrial facility. And this is an area where they're creating, of course, bombs and artillery shells. And so what was reported by them, so of course, take it with a grain of salt, like I said, with the deep state reporting, but this is from the Russian side this time. They're claiming that they were able to increase the production of bombs and artillery 5-fold over the past year, and that's from March 24, so from 23 to 24. And that especially there was a large rise within the first few months of 2024, and this included the beginning of mass production of Fab 3000s in February of this year. And then there was a massive increase in Fab 500s, many times increase, and then a double increase in production of Fab 1500s. And so this is when we started seeing, I guess, on June 20th of 2024, that's when we started seeing the first footage of Fab 3000s being utilized, not around Vovchansk, but just to the west around the Lipty area. And so we got 2 videos of Fab 3000 so far. I guess the main takeaway from both videos, when you look at them, the Russians are trying to target larger buildings using them, and that for the most part they're missing by 10-20 meters, even though they have the UMPK glide kits. This is of course going to be true. It's going to make sense because of how much they weigh, and because they weigh so much, then a Russian Su-34 can only carry 1 Fab 3000 during a particular strike, but at the same time it could carry 3 Fab 1500s. And so you can see how, even though the individual Fab 1500s are smaller in their yield, together they, of course, are more than just a singular one of these 3000s. And so there's a particular point where the 3000 is more useful if you're trying to concentrate force on a specific large industrial center. But in terms of broader damage, then together the 1500s are more important. They're more accurate. They're, I guess you could say, more cost effective and less burdensome on the plane. And so a lot of Russian sources are saying that it would be preferable to improve the accuracy on the Fab 500 and 1500s rather than trying to splash a lot of money on the 3000. And it's something that's going to be very important moving forward, regardless of the weight of the bomb, is its way of dealing with electronic warfare. Because, of course, now the UMPKs, they're utilizing very simple means of satellite guidance, for instance, or inertial guidance, but there's going to come a time where they're going to have to significantly improve their counter jamming capabilities in order to prevent a lot of their bombs from being redirected and failing to hit their target accurately, because both sides are improving when it comes to the electronic warfare front, and that's going to lead to more expensive solutions. And so yeah, that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.